A grandmother notices her rescue dog refuses to leave her infant granddaughter's side, night after night, curling up beside the crib as if on guard. Curious, she sets up a baby monitor, and what she sees leaves her trembling. Faint, ghostly noises. The dog nudging the baby awake. A life-threatening secret that only he seems to understand. How did this dog know to save her granddaughter's life? And what deeper mystery ties him to a past that could change everything? This heartwarming yet gripping story will leave you breathless until the very end. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The soft morning light barely filtered through Emma Thornton's bedroom curtains when Lily's cries pierced the silence. Emma's eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion. Her joints ached as she pushed herself up from the bed, each movement a reminder of her 68 years. The old mattress creaked beneath her as she swung her feet to the floor, her worn slippers waiting faithfully beside the bed. "Coming, sweetheart," she called out, her voice hoarse from another restless night. Her fingers fumbled with her robe's belt as she hurried toward the sound. The familiar weight of grief pressed against her chest as she walked down the hallway. 3 months had passed since the accident that took Sarah, her beloved daughter, but the pain felt as fresh as yesterday. Family photos lined the walls, Sarah's graduation, her wedding day, her proud smile holding newborn Lily. Emma's hand trembled as she passed them, each image a bittersweet reminder of happier times. The morning shadows seemed to dance across Sarah's frozen smiles. In the nursery, Lily's face was scrunched up, tiny fists waving in the air. Max, the golden Labrador, was already there, his tail wagging gently as Emma entered. He'd been by the crib all night as usual. His fur caught the early morning light, giving him an almost golden glow as he stood guard. "Good morning, you two," Emma whispered, lifting Lily into her arms. The baby's cries softened to whimpers, her little body naturally curling into her grandmother's embrace. "Let's get you changed and fed, shall we?" The familiar scent of baby powder and lotion filled her nose as she held Lily close. The day unfolded like so many others before it. Emma warmed bottles, changed diapers, and tackled mountains of laundry that seemed to multiply whenever she turned her back. Max followed their every move, his gentle brown eyes watching attentively. His paws made soft padding sounds on the hardwood floors as he trailed them from room to room. "You're quite the guardian angel, aren't you?" Emma said to Max as she folded tiny onesies. He'd been a spontaneous adoption from the local shelter 2 months ago, when the silence in the house had become too much to bear. Now, she couldn't imagine life without him. His steady presence filled the empty spaces that grief had carved into their home. During Lily's afternoon nap, Emma noticed something that had become a pattern. Max positioned himself right beside the crib, his body alert despite his relaxed posture. He'd done this since day one, but Emma had been too overwhelmed to really notice until now. His ears would twitch at the slightest sound from the sleeping baby. "You never leave her side during nap time, do you?" she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. His fur felt silky beneath her fingers, and he leaned into her touch without taking his eyes off the crib. Evening arrived with its familiar routine of bath time and bedtime stories. As Emma settled Lily into her crib, the baby's eyes grew heavy. Max took up his usual position, laying down beside the crib like a faithful sentinel. The soft glow of the nightlight cast gentle shadows across the nursery walls. Emma stood in the doorway, watching as Lily's tiny hand reached out through the crib slats. Her heart swelled as a smile spread across the baby's face, her fingers brushing against Max's fur. Oh, for the first time in weeks, Emma felt something other than crushing grief. A small spark of hope. fragile but real. The moonlight streaming through the window seemed to wrap them all in its gentle embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was thanking Max, Lily, or perhaps something bigger than all of them. In that moment, the weight on her shoulders felt just a little lighter. The quiet of the house felt peaceful rather than empty, filled with the soft sounds of Lily's steady breathing and Max's gentle presence. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by tiny onesies and baby blankets. The evening had settled in, casting long shadows across the worn carpet, making the pile of laundry look like miniature mountains in the fading light. Max lay nearby, his golden fur catching the last rays of sunlight through the window, his watchful eyes never straying far from Emma's movements. A soft whimper crackled through the baby monitor. Emma glanced up at the small screen perched on the coffee table, between a cold cup of tea and Sarah's favorite photo frame. To her amazement, Max was already there, stationed faithfully by Lily's crib, his tail sweeping gently across the nursery floor. "You really are something special, aren't you?" Emma whispered, watching Max's gentle movements on the screen. He circled the crib once, then settled down, his snout pointed toward Lily, his body perfectly still except for his steady breathing. The sight brought tears to Emma's eyes. Not sad ones this time, but tears of gratitude for this unexpected blessing that had wandered into their lives when they needed him most. As the evening wore on, Emma noticed Max's behavior becoming increasingly odd. He paced more than usual, letting out small, worried barks that seemed out of character for him. Every few minutes, he'd shift positions. His ears perked up, as if listening for something only he could hear, his tail twitching with nervous energy. "What's wrong, boy?" Emma asked, but Max just whined softly in response, his brown eyes filled with an urgency she couldn't understand. Concerned, Emma retrieved the baby monitor's instruction manual from the kitchen drawer, pushing aside old takeout menus and warranty cards. She'd never properly set it up, having only used the basic functions since bringing Lily home. Following the directions carefully, she adjusted the camera angle to capture the entire crib, making sure the night vision was working correctly, testing it by dimming the nursery lights. Later that night, Emma jolted awake in her bed, her heart racing. Strange sounds whispered through the monitor, soft, ghostly noises she couldn't quite identify. Was that a voice? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she hurried down the hallway to Lily's room, her bare feet silent against the cold wooden floor. The nursery was peaceful when she entered, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight. Lily slept soundly, and Max lay in his usual spot beside the crib, his eyes reflecting the dim light. Nothing seemed amiss, but Emma's hand shook as she checked on her granddaughter, touching her tiny chest to feel its rise and fall. Back in her bedroom, Emma picked up the monitor and rewound the footage, her fingers trembling on the controls. What she saw made her blood run cold. In the grainy night vision recording, Lily had stopped breathing, completely still in her crib. Max had noticed immediately, gently nudging the baby until she stirred and began breathing again, his actions precise and purposeful. Emma watched the scene repeat itself twice more in the footage. Each time, Max's actions were deliberate and life-saving, his instincts proving sharper than any medical device. Her hands trembled as she replayed the video again and again, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed, wondering how long this had been happening without her knowledge. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Emma clutched the monitor to her chest, feeling its warmth against her cotton nightgown. The reality of what could have happened, what might still happen, sent waves of fear through her body. She reached for her phone, already planning to call the pediatrician first thing in the morning, knowing sleep would be impossible until she had answers. The morning sun painted the road in shades of gold. but Emma barely noticed its beauty. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove to the pediatrician's office, casting frequent glances at Lily through the rearview mirror. The baby monitor sat heavy in her purse, its footage weighing on her mind even more than its physical presence. Her stomach churned with worry as she navigated the familiar streets, each traffic light seeming to last an eternity. "We'll figure this out, sweetheart," Emma whispered, more to calm herself than Lily, who dozed peacefully in her car seat. Max's discovery had shaken Emma to her core, and every minute until they reached the doctor's office felt like an eternity. She found herself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, as if Lily might suddenly stop breathing even in broad daylight. In the waiting room, Emma bounced Lily gently on her knee, her heart racing as other parents came and went. The cheerful zoo-themed wallpaper and scattered toys did nothing to ease her anxiety. When Dr. Abigail Morris finally called them in, Emma nearly stumbled in her rush to enter the examination room, clutching Lily protectively against her chest. "Mrs. Thornton," Dr. Morris greeted them warmly, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "What brings you and little Lily in today?" Emma's hands trembled as she pulled out the baby monitor, nearly dropping it in her nervousness. I need you to see something," she managed, her voice catching. She played the footage, watching Dr. Morris's expression grow serious as she observed Max's actions during the night. The room fell silent except for the soft sounds from the monitor's speaker. After a thorough examination of Lily and several tests, including a pulse oximeter reading and respiratory assessment, Dr. Morris sat down across from Emma. "What you've captured here is incredibly important," she began gently. "Lily has a condition called sleep apnea, a rare form that causes her to stop breathing periodically during sleep. Your dog, Max." She paused, shaking her head in amazement. "He's been detecting these episodes and intervening at exactly the right moments." Emma's legs went weak, and she clutched Lily closer to her chest, inhaling the sweet baby powder scent of her granddaughter's hair. "If Max hadn't been there—" "But he was," Dr. Morris assured her, placing a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "And now we can get Lily the proper treatment she needs. Your dog's instincts quite literally saved her life. We'll start by setting up a sleep study and then discuss our options for monitoring and treatment." Tears streamed down Emma's face as the full weight of the situation hit her. All those nights Max had stayed by the crib, his unusual attentiveness, it hadn't been just devotion, but a desperate attempt to protect Lily. She thought of all the times she'd wondered why he was so fixated on the baby, and now the truth left her both grateful and terrified. That evening, Emma sat in the nursery's rocking chair, watching Max in his usual spot beside Lily's crib. The setting sun cast a warm glow across the room, highlighting Max's golden fur and the gentle rise and fall of Lily's chest as she slept. She slid down to sit beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling his steady heartbeat against her side. "You're our guardian angel," she whispered, running her fingers through his soft fur. Max leaned into her touch, his eyes never leaving Lily's sleeping form. His dedication brought fresh tears to her eyes. Emma held him close, overwhelmed with gratitude for this remarkable dog who had become so much more than just a pet. He was their miracle, their protector, their saving grace. Emma sank deeper into her favorite armchair, enjoying a rare moment of peace while Lily napped upstairs with Max keeping watch. Her tablet's soft glow illuminated her tired face as she scrolled through local news updates. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the living room windows, and she could hear the distant sound of children playing outside. Suddenly, her finger froze mid-swipe. The headline made her stomach drop. "Local animal shelter faces demolition." Her hands shaking, Emma clicked the link. There it was, the same shelter where she'd found Max just months ago. The article showed a photo of the worn but welcoming building where she'd first locked eyes with the golden Labrador who would become her family's guardian angel. She remembered that day clearly, the nervous excitement, the way Max had immediately walked over to her, tail wagging gently. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered, quickly dialing the shelter's number. Her heart pounded as she waited, dreading the confirmation of what she'd just read. After several rings, a weary voice answered. "Riverside Animal Shelter. This is Walter speaking." "Hello, I'm Emma Thornton. I adopted Max from you last spring. I just read about the shelter closing." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Ah, Max," Walter's voice warmed slightly. "Such a special dog. Yes, I'm afraid it's true. Harrison Kane bought the property last month. He's given us 30 days to clear out." The defeat in his tone made Emma's heart ache. Emma clutched the phone tighter. Harrison Kane? One of the biggest developers in town. He's planning luxury apartments here. Walter sighed heavily. "We've tried everything, but we can't match his resources. These animals, they deserve better than this. Some have been with us for months, waiting for their forever homes." "But there must be something we can do," Emma insisted, thinking of Max sleeping beside Lily's crib, watching over her precious granddaughter. The memory of how he'd alerted her that first night when Lily stopped breathing flashed through her mind. "Kane's not the type to change his mind. Money talks, Mrs. Thornton, and we're fresh out of that." Walter's voice cracked slightly. 20 years I've run this place, seen thousands of animals find homes. Now it'll all be concrete and glass. The thought of telling our volunteers breaks my heart." Emma's chest tightened as she thought about all the other animals like Max, waiting for their chance at a new life. Without the shelter, where would they go? Who would save them? The weight of helplessness pressed down on her shoulders. That evening, Emma stood in her bedroom holding a framed photo of Sarah. Her daughter's smile beamed back at her, full of the determination and spirit that had always inspired Emma. The silver frame caught the light from her bedside lamp, making Sarah's eyes sparkle just as they had in life. "I don't know if I can do this, sweetheart," Emma whispered to the photograph. "Taking on someone like Harrison Kane. I'm just a grandmother." She traced Sarah's face with her finger, remembering her daughter's fierce dedication to fighting for what was right. "But you never backed down from a challenge, did you?" From upstairs came the soft sound of Max's paws padding across the floor, checking on Lily as he always did. The familiar routine of his watchful care brought tears to Emma's eyes. Her resolve strengthened. This shelter had given her Max, and Max had saved Lily. She owed them both more than just gratitude. Setting the photo down gently beside her bed, Emma walked to her closet and pulled out her best blazer. She smoothed the navy fabric with trembling hands, remembering the last time she'd worn it to Sarah's funeral. Tomorrow morning she would face Harrison Kane, even if the thought made her knees weak. She had to try. For Max, for the shelter, and for all the animals who deserved a chance at finding their own families to protect. Sarah would have expected nothing less. Emma's alarm buzzed at 5:30, though she'd barely slept. Her mind had raced all night, rehearsing arguments and scenarios. She dressed carefully in her best navy dress and sensible shoes, her hands smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the fabric. Through the baby monitor, she watched Max's tail thump softly against the floor as he maintained his vigilant post by Lily's crib, his golden fur catching the dim light of dawn. Mrs. Henderson from next door arrived to watch Lily, her kind smile and flour-dusted apron doing little to ease Emma's churning stomach. "You've got this, dear," she said, patting Emma's arm. "And don't worry about rushing back. Lily and I will bake cookies, won't we, sweetheart? The drive downtown felt surreal, like something from another life. Modern glass buildings stretched toward a steel-gray sky, heavy with approaching rain, their windows reflecting the gloomy morning light. Emma parked her aging sedan between two gleaming luxury cars, feeling as out of place as a dandelion in a rose garden, its navy paint dulled by years of faithful service. Kane Industries occupied the top 3 floors of the city's newest office tower, its logo emblazoned in chrome and blue glass. In the elevator, Emma's reflection showed a woman trying her best to look confident, despite her trembling hands and the way she kept tucking loose strands of gray hair behind her ears. "Mrs. Thornton?" A sleek receptionist in a crisp black suit led her through a maze of glass and chrome to a corner conference room. "Mr. Kane will be with you shortly. Would you care for some water?" Emma sat rigid in the leather chair, her purse clutched tightly in her lap like a shield. The wall-to-wall windows offered a commanding view of the city, making her feel small and insignificant against the backdrop of skyscrapers and distant mountains. Harrison Kane strode in precisely on time, his tailored suit as sharp as his expression, every dark hair perfectly in place. "Mrs. Thornton, I understand you wanted to discuss the Riverside property." His handshake was brief, professional, and cold, like shaking hands with a marble statue. "Yes, thank you for seeing me." Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. "The shelter there, it's special. My dog Max, he saved my granddaughter's life. She has a rare sleep disorder, and Max..." Her voice cracked slightly, memories of those terrifying nights flooding back. "He wakes her when she stops breathing. Without that shelter, without Max, I might have lost her too." Kane's expression didn't change, his dark eyes remaining as impassive as winter frost. "While that's a touching story, Mrs. Thornton, business decisions can't be based on sentiment. The market doesn't run on emotions." "But the shelter helps so many families find companions like Max. Surely there must be another property." "That particular location holds significance beyond its market value," Kane cut in, his jaw tightening visibly beneath his clean-shaven skin. "My father owned that land before the shelter. He gave it away without consulting his family, without considering our future plans. This purchase rights an old wrong." Emma leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Your father must have had his reasons." "My father," Kane's voice turned to ice, each word sharp enough to cut, "chose stray animals over his own son's future. I'm simply correcting that mistake. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another meeting." The dismissal stung like a slap. Emma gathered her purse with trembling fingers and walked out, her shoes clicking against the polished floor like a countdown. In the lobby, she heard the first drops of rain hitting the windows, a gentle percussion that matched her falling hopes. Her eyes burned with unshed tears as she stepped outside, the warm drops mixing with the moisture on her cheeks. Standing under the building's overhang, Emma watched the rain darken the sidewalk to charcoal. Her shoulders slumped with the weight of defeat, but beneath her disappointment, a familiar stubborn resolve began to take root. The same determination that had carried her through Sarah's death and countless sleepless nights with Lily stirred in her chest, whispering that this wasn't over yet. The morning sun filtered through Emma's kitchen window, casting warm patches on the worn linoleum floor. She sat at her small table, a coffee mug warming her hands as she spread out colorful pamphlets from the shelter. The steam rose in delicate wisps, carrying the comforting aroma of her morning brew. Max lay at her feet, his golden head resting on her slippers, occasionally letting out a concerned whimper as if he understood the weight of her worry. "There has to be a way," Emma muttered, making notes on a yellow legal pad. The numbers were daunting, The shelter needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase the property outright. Her pen tapped against the paper in a nervous rhythm as she struggled to make the figures work. After finishing her coffee, leaving just a trace of brown in the bottom of her favorite ceramic mug, Emma grabbed her purse. "Come on, Max, let's go visit your old home." The dog's tail wagged hopefully as he rose to follow her. The shelter sat on the outskirts of town, a modest building with peeling paint and a sign that had seen better days. Still, the grounds were clean and well kept, with cheerful flower beds lining the walkway. Purple petunias and yellow marigolds added splashes of color against the aging structure. Inside, the familiar smell of dog food and cleaning supplies filled the air. Walter Grayson emerged from his office, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his kind eyes. "Emma, what a pleasant surprise!" He bent down to scratch Mac's ears, his arthritis-stiffened fingers gentle against the dog's fur. "And look, who's come back to visit." They settled in Walter's cramped office, where photographs of adopted pets covered every wall like a patchwork quilt of happy endings. "You know," Walter said, shuffling through some old files, their corners worn from years of handling, "Max here has quite a history. Before you adopted him, he actually saved another child." Emma leaned forward, her heart quickening. "What do you mean?" "The details are fuzzy now. It was a few years back. But he had this same protective instinct." Walter's eyes grew distant, as if watching the memory play out. "Something about a swimming pool, I think. The previous owner never gave us the full story." As they toured the facility, Emma met Sarah, a college student who volunteered on weekends, her enthusiasm infectious as she cleaned kennels, and Tom, a retired veteran who walked the dogs daily, his military bearing softened by his gentle way with the animals. Each had their own touching stories about animals finding forever homes. "This sweet girl just got adopted yesterday," Sarah said, showing Emma a photo of a three-legged cat with bright green eyes and a determined expression. "She's going to live with an amputee veteran." They connected instantly. You should have seen how she curled right up in his lap. Tom shared how a rescued German Shepherd had helped his grandson overcome his fear of dogs. "This place," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. "It's more than just a shelter. It's where healing happens, for the animals and the people." Walking through the kennels, Emma noticed Mac's behavior change. He seemed to recognize certain spots, pausing to sniff corners or wag his tail at specific kennels, his body language showing flickers of memory. Walter watched with interest, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "You know," he said thoughtfully, leaning against a worn doorframe, "Max was different from our other dogs. More purposeful somehow. Like he knew exactly what he was meant to do. He always had that special something about him." Emma's mind whirled with questions about Mac's mysterious past. If he had saved another child before, perhaps that story could help save the shelter. The pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, just out of reach. On the drive home, Emma glanced at Max in her rearview mirror. He sat alertly in the back seat, his amber eyes meeting hers, with an intelligence that never failed to move her. "We're going to save your home, buddy," she whispered, her voice thick with determination. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, seeming to promise better days ahead. The morning light streamed through Emma's kitchen windows as she sat at her small table, phone pressed to her ear. A list of animal advocacy groups lay before her, already marked with too many X's. Her coffee had grown cold, forgotten during hours of calls. "I understand your organization is busy," she said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Yes, thank you for your time." She hung up and crossed off another name with such force that her pen nearly tore through the paper. Max padded over and rested his head on her knee, his brown eyes full of concern. Emma scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his presence. "That's the 5th no this morning, buddy. But we're not done yet, are we?" By noon, Emma had exhausted her list of phone calls. Each conversation ended the same way: polite expressions of concern, followed by carefully worded excuses. Her throat was sore from talking, and her spirits were dropping with each rejection. Refusing to give up, she grabbed a stack of handmade flyers and headed out into her neighborhood. The spring air was mild, but Emma's nerves made her shiver as she approached each house. The colorful flyers trembled slightly in her hands as she walked up each driveway. "The shelter's been here for 20 years, she explained to Mrs. Peterson, who stood in her doorway clutching her bathrobe. "We need community support to save it. It's helped so many families find their perfect pets." "Oh dear, that's terrible about the shelter," Mrs. Peterson said, glancing nervously down the street as if expecting someone to be watching. "But you know how it is with Harrison Kane. He always gets his way in this town. Best not to make waves. I'm sure you understand." House after house, Emma heard similar responses. Some neighbors wouldn't even open their doors fully, peeking out through barely cracked doorways. Kane's name hung over every conversation like a storm cloud, casting shadows over any hope of support. Sitting on a park bench to rest her tired feet, Emma pulled out an old photo from her wallet. Sarah smiled back at her, arms raised in triumph at a protest rally for local environmental causes. Her daughter's eyes sparkled with determination in the captured moment. "You never backed down from a fight, did you, sweetheart?" Emma whispered, running her finger along the edge of the worn photo. "You'd be telling me to keep going." As the sun began to set, Emma settled onto her front porch, the wooden steps creaking beneath her. Max lay beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg. The sky blazed orange and pink, but Emma barely noticed its beauty through her disappointment. Her stack of flyers, barely diminished, sat beside her like a reminder of the day's failures. "Well, Max," she said, scratching under his chin, "looks like it's just you and me in this fight." She took a deep breath of the evening air, catching the scent of blooming jasmine from her garden. "But that's okay. We're not giving up. I promise you that." Max lifted his head and licked her hand, his eyes full of trust. Emma managed a small smile, finding strength in his unwavering loyalty. The gentle thump of his tail against the porch boards seemed to echo her determination. "Your first home gave me you," she told him softly. "And you saved Lily. Now it's my turn to save the shelter, even if I have to do it alone." Emma settled into her desk chair that evening, a steaming cup of chamomile tea beside her, its soothing aroma filling the quiet room. Lily's soft breathing came through the baby monitor, accompanied by Max's occasional gentle snoring from his spot by the crib. The manila folder Walter had given her sat unopened on her desk, its edges worn with age and spotted with water stains from years of storage. "Let's see what stories you hold," she murmured, carefully opening the folder. Old photographs spilled out, black and white images of the shelter's early days, showing smiling volunteers and hopeful faces of both people and pets. Her fingers traced over faded adoption records and newspaper clippings, some so delicate they threatened to crumble at her touch. One particular document caught her eye. It was a dog license from 5 years ago, the paper creased but still legible, with a small coffee stain in one corner. Emma's hands trembled as she read the owner's name, Victor Kane. Her heart skipped a beat. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, sitting up straighter, her tea forgotten. Max had belonged to Harrison Kane's father? She dug deeper into the folder, finding donation receipts signed by Victor Kane, spanning over 2 decades. The amounts were substantial, some reaching well into 5 figures. Clearly, the shelter had meant something special to him. A yellowed newspaper article showed a younger Victor Kane cutting a ribbon at the shelter's renovation ceremony. His smile was warm and genuine, reaching all the way to his kind eyes, nothing like his son's cold demeanor. His hand rested on the shoulder of a young volunteer in the photo. Below the image, the article mentioned Victor's dedication to saving abandoned animals and his vision of making the shelter a cornerstone of hope in the community, describing his passionate speech about second chances. Emma's mind raced as pieces clicked into place, her fingers drumming lightly on the desk. Harrison's determination to tear down the shelter wasn't just about property value. It was personal. Something about this place, about his father's connection to it, drove him to want it destroyed. The bitterness in his voice whenever the shelter came up suddenly made sense. She spread the documents across her desk, creating a timeline of Victor's involvement with the shelter. The final donation was dated just weeks before his death, the signature slightly shaky but determined. Mac's adoption papers showed he had been surrendered shortly after, with no mention of Harrison Kane ever claiming his father's beloved pet. The paperwork noted Mac's gentle temperament and special training, though the details were vague. The baby monitor crackled softly, its green light pulsing. Emma looked up to see Max lifting his head, checking on Lily before settling back down with a contented sigh. She thought about how this dog, once cherished by Victor Kane, had ended up saving her granddaughter's life. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be just chance. "We have to make him understand," Emma said softly, gathering the papers into a neat pile, her movements deliberate and careful. She glanced at the monitor again, watching Lily sleep peacefully with her faithful guardian nearby. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice steady with newfound purpose, "I'll make him listen. He needs to know what his father built here." Emma pulled into the parking lot of Kane Development, her hands gripping the manila folder on the passenger seat. She'd kissed Lily goodbye at Mrs. Peterson's house just 30 minutes ago, but it felt like hours. The gray clouds hanging low in the sky matched her churning stomach. A gust of wind rustled through the nearly empty parking lot, making the trees sway ominously. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, stepping out of her car. Her sweater fluttered in the breeze as she smoothed down her skirt, trying to look as professional as possible. The sleek office building loomed before her as she marched through the glass doors, its polished windows reflecting the stormy sky like mirrors. Without stopping at reception, she headed straight for Harrison Kane's office, her sensible shoes clicking against the marble floor. His assistant called out, half rising from her desk, but Emma kept walking, her heart pounding with each step. Kane looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face, before settling into annoyance. His expensive suit and perfectly organized desk spoke of a man who valued control above all else. "Mrs. Thornton, I don't recall scheduling another meeting." "Because I didn't make one," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. The trembling in her hands betrayed her nerves as she placed the folder on his desk and pulled out the old license. "I found something you need to see." Kane's eyes narrowed as she laid out the documents, his jaw tightening visibly. "Max belonged to your father, Mr. Kane. Victor Kane wasn't just a donor to the shelter, he was devoted to it. And Max? Max was his dog." The color drained from Kane's face. He snatched up the license, his hands shaking slightly. The paper crinkled under his tight grip. "Where did you get this?" "The shelter keeps detailed records." Emma spread out more papers, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of old photographs and donation receipts. "Your father visited weekly. He helped fund their medical program. He—" "Enough!" Kane slammed his palm on the desk, making his coffee mug rattle. "My father's charitable choices have nothing to do with my business decisions. You're meddling in things you don't understand. I understand that Max saved my granddaughter's life, Emma pressed on, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like he saved another child when your father had him. The shelter isn't just a building, Mr. Kane. It's a place where second chances happen, where lives change." Kane stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made Emma flinch. "You think digging up my father's past will change anything? He chose that shelter over his own family, over me." His voice cracked slightly before hardening. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I'll have my lawyers expedite the demolition papers this afternoon." Emma felt the blood drain from her face, her legs suddenly weak. "Mr. Kane, please." "Get out," he snapped, turning away to face the window, "before I have security remove you." Emma gathered the scattered papers with trembling hands, some falling to the floor in her haste. She walked out of the office, past the concerned assistant, who watched her with sympathetic eyes, through the lobby and into the parking lot. Inside her car, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, trying to steady her ragged breathing. Tears pricked at her eyes as she stared at the building through her windshield. The threatening clouds above seemed ready to burst, much like her hopes of saving the shelter. A distant rumble of thunder echoed her despair, promising a storm that would match the one in her heart. Emma pulled into her driveway, exhausted from her confrontation with Harrison Kane. Her shoulders ached from the tension she'd been carrying all day. The sight of Walter Grayson on her front porch made her sit up straighter. He stood there holding what looked like old papers and a worn thermos, his kind face creased with concern. The evening light caught the silver in his hair as Max bounded over to greet him, tail wagging enthusiastically, his golden coat glowing in the sunset. "I heard about your meeting with Harrison," Walter said softly, his eyes full of understanding. "Thought you might need some company and a hot drink." Inside, Emma settled into her favorite armchair, the familiar cushions offering small comfort after such a difficult day. Walter poured them both coffee from his thermos, the rich aroma filling the cozy living room. The steam curled up between them as Max lay at their feet, occasionally lifting his head to glance between them with soulful eyes. "You know, Victor Kane wasn't always the generous man I knew," Walter began, his voice warm with memory, fingers tapping thoughtfully against his mug. "The shelter changed him, gave him purpose after his wife passed. He found healing there among the animals who needed him." Emma wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing strength from its heat. "Harrison seems to hate everything the shelter stands for. I saw it in his eyes today." Walter nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "There's more to that story than most people know." He reached into his jacket and pulled out several yellowed envelopes, carefully bound together with a faded ribbon. "Victor wrote to me often, especially near the end. He had such hopes for this place, and for Harrison. The letters got more frequent as his health declined." Emma accepted the letters with trembling hands, feeling the weight of history in the delicate paper. "What kind of hopes?" "That's something you should read for yourself," Walter said, standing up with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the words of those we've lost carry more weight than anything we could say." He patted Max's head before heading to the door, his footsteps quiet on the wooden floor. "Don't give up yet, Emma. You might find what you need in those pages." After Walter left, Emma curled up on her couch with the letters spread across her lap, the paper rustling softly as she sorted through them. Max settled beside her, his warm presence reassuring as she began to read by lamplight. Victor's elegant handwriting filled page after page with stories about the shelter, his dreams for its future, and hints of regret about his relationship with Harrison. The words painted a picture of a man trying desperately to leave behind something meaningful. One particular letter made her pause, the paper slightly worn at the corners from frequent handling. "This shelter," Victor had written, is more than just a building. It's a home for second chances. For the animals, yes, but also for the people who find their way here. I only wish Harrison could understand that. Perhaps someday he will see what I've seen, that healing happens in the most unexpected places. Emma ran her fingers over the words, feeling the weight of Victor's hope and sadness in every line. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the emotion behind the words remained as strong as ever. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the town archives as Emma signed in at the front desk. Her fingers drummed nervously on the counter, while the elderly clerk, a woman with wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair pulled into a neat bun, directed her to the local history section. The musty smell of old papers and leather bindings filled her nose as she made her way down the narrow aisles lined with metal shelving. Family records, business permits. Ah, here we go, Emma muttered, pulling out a weathered cardboard box labeled Kane Family Documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed newspapers and personal correspondence, carefully preserved despite their age. A black and white photograph caught her eye, a younger Victor Kane standing proudly in front of the shelter on its opening day, his dark hair untouched by gray and his stance full of purpose. His smile reminded her of the way Harrison's eyes crinkled when he wasn't scowling, those rare moments when his guard dropped. As she dug deeper, Emma discovered a collection of letters tucked into a faded manila envelope, the paper soft and delicate with age. The first one made her breath catch in her throat. "My dearest Harrison," it began in careful, measured handwriting, "I know you think the shelter has taken me away from you. Perhaps you're right. After your mother died, I couldn't face our empty house or your grief-stricken eyes. I threw myself into this work, telling myself I was doing good, but I was really running away. I'm sorry, son. I hope someday you'll understand that this place became my way of making amends, not just to the animals we save, but to myself." Emma's eyes welled up as she read letter after letter, her heart aching for both father and son. Each one revealed more of Victor's internal struggle, his guilt over neglecting Harrison, his desperate attempt to find meaning in helping abandoned animals, his hope that the shelter could become a bridge between them instead of a wall. Some pages bore water stains that she suspected were tears. A newspaper clipping from 15 years ago showed a teenage Harrison at a shelter fundraiser, standing apart from his father, arms crossed and face turned away. His posture radiated teenage defiance and hurt. The caption read, "Local businessman Victor Kane celebrates shelter's anniversary with son Harrison." The tension between them was almost palpable, even in the faded newsprint. More letters painted a clearer picture, each one filling in another piece of the puzzle. Harrison had resented the long hours his father spent at the shelter, the missed baseball games, the empty chair at dinner. While Victor poured his heart into saving strays, his son had felt like one himself, left behind in an empty house with only his anger for company. Emma sat back in her chair, running her hands through her hair as fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The truth was more complicated than she'd imagined. Harrison wasn't just a cold-hearted developer. He was a wounded son still carrying the pain of his father's choices, nursing hurts that had never properly healed. As she drove home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the road, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Emma's mind churned with everything she'd learned, her fingers tight on the steering wheel. Harrison's hostility toward the shelter wasn't just about business. It was personal, wrapped up in years of hurt and abandonment. She needed to find a way to reach the grieving son behind the businessman's mask, but without making him feel cornered or accused. Maybe, she thought, Understanding his pain was the first step toward healing it. The kitchen light cast a warm glow as Emma prepared tea, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions. The scent of chamomile filled the air, offering a small measure of comfort. The doorbell rang, and Mac's tail wagged as Walter's familiar figure appeared on her doorstep. His weathered face looked more lined than usual, the worry evident in every crease, and in his hands he clutched a yellowed envelope that had clearly been handled many times. "I need to show you something," Walter said softly, settling into a chair at her kitchen table. He placed the envelope between them like it was made of glass. Emma noticed his hands trembling slightly, his fingers tapping nervously against the worn paper. "What is it?" Emma asked, setting 2 steaming mugs of tea on the table. She slid one toward Walter, watching as the steam curled up between them. Walter ran his finger along the envelope's edge, his expression heavy with decades of kept secrets. "It's a letter from Victor Kane to Harrison, written just days before Victor passed away." He looked up at Emma, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I've kept it all this time, afraid of making things worse. The timing never seemed right." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "May I?" she asked, reaching for the envelope, her fingers hovering uncertainly above it. Walter nodded, and Emma carefully opened it. The paper inside was crisp but aged, covered in neat handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words remained clear and powerful. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. "My dear Harrison," the letter began, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's so much I need to say, so many wrongs I need to right. The shelter became my way of making amends, not just to the animals we saved, but to you. Every second chance we gave them was a reminder of the second chance I hope to have with you." Emma looked up at Walter, her heart aching with the raw emotion in Victor's words. "Why didn't you show this to Harrison before?" Walter sighed deeply, wrapping his hands around his mug as if seeking warmth. "Harrison was so angry after Victor died. He wouldn't even attend the funeral. I worried this would just fuel his resentment. The wound was too fresh, too deep." "But this letter?" Emma gestured to the pages, her voice soft but urgent. "Victor explains everything. His regrets, his hopes for Harrison to continue his work at the shelter. This could change everything. It might be exactly what Harrison needs to hear. Or it could make him even more determined to tear it all down," Walter countered. But Emma was already shaking her head, determination lighting her features. "We have to try," she insisted. "We need to show him this letter, help him understand his father's heart. Everyone deserves a chance at healing." They spent the next hour planning their approach, discussing the best way to present the letter to Harrison. Max moved between them, offering silent support as they talked, his warm presence a steady comfort in the emotionally charged atmosphere. As the evening drew to a close, Emma held the letter in her hands, feeling its weight. This piece of paper represented more than just words. It was a father's last attempt to reach his son, to bridge a gap that had grown too wide. The responsibility of delivering it felt enormous. "I'll go see him tomorrow morning," Emma said firmly, looking at Walter across the table. Max rested his head on her lap, and she scratched behind his ears absently, drawing strength from his steady presence. Walter nodded slowly, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through his worried expression. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time. Just be gentle with him, Emma. Some wounds take a lifetime to heal." The morning sun filtered through Emma's kitchen window as she carefully placed Victor's letter in her bag, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the worn envelope, tracing the faded ink of Victor Kane's careful handwriting. Max watched her intently from his spot by the door, his tail giving a gentle wag, his brown eyes full of understanding. "We have to try, don't we, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Max leaned into her touch, offering silent support. After dropping Lily off with Mrs. Henderson next door, Emma picked up Walter. They drove to Kane's office building in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The gleaming glass tower stretched toward the sky, seeming more imposing than ever, its polished windows reflecting the morning light like a wall of mirrors. At the reception desk, a polished young woman in a crisp blazer shook her head, barely glancing up from her computer. "Mr. Kane isn't taking any unscheduled appointments today. Perhaps you could call to arrange something next week." "Please," Emma said firmly, squaring her shoulders. "Tell him Emma Thornton and Walter Grayson need to speak with him. It's about his father." Minutes later, they were escorted through a maze of sleek corridors to Kane's corner office. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to them, rigid with tension. "Whatever this is about, make it quick," he said coldly, his reflection visible in the glass. Emma's throat felt dry as paper. "Mr. Kane, we found something you need to see." She pulled out the letter with trembling fingers. "It's from your father." Kane spun around, his face flushing dark red. "What are you talking about?" Walter stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Victor wrote this just before he passed. He wanted you to have it. He was very specific about that." Kane's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching at his temple. "So you've been digging through my family's private matters?" His voice rose sharply, echoing off the modern art pieces that adorned his walls. "How dare you?" "Please," Emma said softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Max, the dog who saved my granddaughter. He was your father's. The shelter meant everything to him. He wanted—" "I don't care what he wanted." Kane slammed his hand on the desk, making his laptop jump. "You have no right to come here with some convenient letter, trying to manipulate me with stories about my father's precious shelter. I've heard enough about that place to last a lifetime." "Harrison," Walter began, reaching out placatingly. "Your father—" "Get out!" Kane shouted, storming toward the door and yanking it open. "Both of you, get out now, and don't come back!" In the parking lot, Emma and Walter stood in stunned silence beneath the towering building. The letter felt heavy in Emma's bag, like a stone weighing down her hopes. "Maybe we were wrong to try," Walter said quietly, his shoulders slumping, suddenly looking every one of his years. Emma shook her head, determination rising through her disappointment. "We can't give up. There has to be another way to reach him. Your father believed in second chances, Walter. Maybe we need to find a different approach." Emma sat on her weathered porch swing, the gentle creaking matching her swaying thoughts. Max's warm presence at her feet offered comfort as she gazed up at the star-filled sky. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, but she barely noticed its sweetness. Her fingers absently traced the worn wood of the armrest, feeling each groove and imperfection that time had carved into it. "I don't know what else to do, boy," she whispered, her voice catching. The weight of her failed attempts to save the shelter pressed heavily on her shoulders. Max lifted his head, his brown eyes full of understanding, and placed his chin on her knee. His fur was soft against her skin, a reminder of the countless lives the shelter had touched, including her own. The sound of tires on gravel broke through her thoughts. Headlights swept across the yard as a car pulled into her driveway, casting long shadows across the autumn-scattered lawn. Emma straightened, puzzled by the late visitor, while Max's ears perked up with interest. A gentle knock echoed through the quiet evening. When Emma opened the door, she found a young woman standing there, holding a small terrier in her arms. The visitor couldn't have been more than 30, with kind eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. "Mrs. Thornton? I'm Rebecca," the woman said softly, hugging her dog closer. "I hope it's not too late to stop by. I heard about what you're doing for the shelter." Her voice carried a note of hesitation mixed with determination. Emma invited her inside, and they settled in the living room. Rebecca's terrier curled up next to Max, who welcomed the smaller dog with a gentle nudge. The two dogs seemed to share an instant connection that brought a flutter of warmth to Emma's chest. "I adopted Sophie here 6 months ago," Rebecca explained, her eyes growing misty as she watched the dogs. "My husband had just passed away, and I was so lost. That shelter, it gave me more than just a pet. It gave me hope when I needed it most." Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap as she spoke. Emma felt her own eyes welling up as Rebecca continued, recognizing the same pain and healing in the younger woman's story that she had experienced herself. "When I heard they might close, I had to come. You're not alone in this fight, Mrs. Thornton. There are others like me who want to help. The shelter matters to so many of us." Rebecca's voice grew stronger with each word, filled with conviction. Rebecca's words seemed to lift some of the heaviness from Emma's heart. Here was living proof of the shelter's importance, sitting right in front of her. The younger woman's determination sparked something inside Emma that had been dimming over the past few days. "We can gather supporters," Rebecca offered earnestly, leaning forward in her chair. "There are more stories like mine, more people who want to help save it. We just need to bring them together." As Emma watched Rebecca drive away later, the stars seemed to shine a bit brighter. She looked down at Max, a small smile forming on her lips. His tail wagged gently against the porch boards, matching the renewed rhythm of hope in her heart. "We're not done yet," she whispered, feeling the first stirrings of real possibility after days of despair. Emma sat at her kitchen table, morning light streaming through the windows and casting a warm glow across her notepad. The gentle rays highlighted the scattered coffee stains and worn edges of her familiar workspace. Max lay beside her chair, his tail thumping softly against the hardwood floor whenever she glanced his way, his golden fur catching the sunlight. She took a deep breath, pen hovering over the blank page, her fingers tight around the familiar blue ballpoint. "Where do I even start?" she murmured, reaching down to scratch Max's ears. His brown eyes met hers with unwavering devotion, and she drew strength from his steady presence. The words began flowing slowly at first, then faster as she opened her heart onto the page, her handwriting growing more confident with each line. "Dear Mr. Kane, I know you've heard my pleas about the shelter, but today I'm writing to share something more personal. 2 years ago, I lost my daughter Sarah in a car accident. The pain of losing a child, it changes you forever. Every morning I wake up missing her, wondering how to keep going, searching for her in the little things she left behind. But then Max came into our lives. He's not just a dog from your father's shelter. He's the reason my granddaughter Lily is alive today. When everyone else missed the signs of her sleep disorder, Max knew. He watched over her, protected her, saved her. Without him, I might have lost the last piece of Sarah I have left. I understand now that the shelter means something different to you. It reminds you of difficult times with your father. But perhaps, like me, your father was trying to find healing through helping others. The shelter wasn't just about the animals. It was about second chances, about finding light in the darkness, about creating something meaningful from pain. I'm not asking you to forgive the past. I'm only asking you to consider that your father's legacy could be something beautiful, something that continues to save lives and bring hope to people who are hurting, just as it did for my family. Emma paused, wiping tears from her cheeks before continuing. Her sleeve came away damp as she gathered her thoughts. She wrote about redemption, about how grief can transform into purpose, and about the unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. Max pressed closer to her leg, offering silent comfort as she poured her heart onto the page. After several attempts crossing out words and starting fresh, she finally had a version that felt right. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope, writing Harrison Kane in careful strokes across the front. The black ink stood stark against the white paper, each letter precise and intentional. At Kane's office building, Emma handed the envelope to his secretary, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, who promised to deliver it personally. As she turned to leave, Emma felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her truth had lifted a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying. The morning sun through the lobby windows seemed brighter, more hopeful. Walking back to her car, Emma released a long breath that seemed to carry weeks of tension with it. She had no way of knowing if Kane would even read the letter, but for the first time since this battle began, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had spoken from her heart. That would have to be enough for now. The truth of her words would have to find their own way to Kane's conscience. Harrison Kane sat in his dimly lit office, the city's evening lights creating a kaleidoscope of colors through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His fingers drummed restlessly on his mahogany desk, where Emma's envelope lay unopened. The crisp white paper seemed to mock him, daring him to confront whatever lay inside. The ticking of the antique clock on the wall only heightened his unease. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, reaching for the letter opener. His hand hesitated for a moment before he gripped the silver handle. With a swift motion, he sliced through the envelope and pulled out several handwritten pages, noting the careful penmanship. As he began to read, Emma's words hit him like a physical force. Her description of losing her daughter Sarah made his throat tight. The raw emotion in her writing was unlike the countless business proposals he usually reviewed. He loosened his tie, suddenly finding it hard to breathe in his perfectly climate-controlled office. "The pain of losing a child. It changes you forever," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the empty office. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. The words blurred as memories flooded back. His father's attempts to connect with him, the countless weekends Victor spent at the shelter instead of at home. But now, through Emma's perspective, those same memories took on a different shade. Her story of Max saving her granddaughter's life stirred something deep within him, something he'd tried to bury beneath years of focused ambition. Kane pushed back from his desk, the leather chair squeaking softly as he rose. Walking to the window, his polished shoes silent against the plush carpet, he stood facing the cityscape. His reflection stared back at him, looking less certain than usual. The hard lines of his face softened by doubt. Emma's words about healing through helping others echoed in his mind, reminding him of conversations he'd had with his father years ago, conversations he'd dismissed as sentimental nonsense. "Maybe you were trying to tell me something, Dad," he said softly to his reflection, his breath fogging the glass slightly. "Maybe I just wasn't ready to hear it." He returned to his desk, finishing the letter with trembling hands. Each word seemed to chip away at the wall of resentment he'd built around his heart, brick by carefully laid brick. The shelter wasn't just a reminder of his father's absence. It was Victor's attempt at creating something meaningful, something lasting, a legacy that went beyond profit margins and property values. Kane placed the letter back on his desk, its pages slightly wrinkled from his tight grip. The paper seemed to hold more weight now, as if the truth within had made it heavier. He turned to the window again, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky, each one a pinpoint of possibility. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider what his father might have truly wanted, Not just for the shelter, but for their relationship, for the man his son could become. The weight of unspoken words and missed opportunities pressed heavily on his shoulders. He remained there, lost in thought, as the city lights continued their silent dance below, and the first stars began to appear in the deepening twilight. The morning sun filtered through Emma's kitchen window, casting warm patterns across the tile as she spooned pureed carrots into Lily's eager mouth. Her granddaughter's blue eyes sparkled with delight at each spoonful. Max lounged nearby on his favorite spot, his tail thumping rhythmically against the hardwood floor, creating a soothing backdrop to their morning routine. A sharp knock at the door made Emma pause mid-spoon, and Max's ears perked up instantly, his body tensing with alertness. "Just a minute," Emma called out, quickly wiping Lily's chin with a soft cloth. She opened the door to find Harrison Kane standing on her porch, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit and polished shoes. Max moved protectively to Emma's side, his golden fur brushing against her leg as he positioned himself between them. "Mrs. Thornton," Kane said, clearing his throat and fidgeting with his tie. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Emma shook her head, too surprised by his unexpected appearance to speak. Kane shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his usual boardroom confidence nowhere to be seen in the morning light. "I read your letter last night," he continued, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, almost vulnerable. "Your words, they made me think about things differently. About the shelter, about my father." Emma gestured for him to come inside, but he remained rooted on the porch, as if crossing the threshold would somehow commit him to something he wasn't ready for. "Would it be possible to visit the shelter? I'd like to see Max's connection to this place myself, understand what my father saw in it." 20 minutes later, Emma pulled into the shelter's parking lot with Kane following in his sleek luxury car. Walter stood at the entrance, his weathered hands clasped together, his eyebrows raised in surprise at their unexpected visitor. His worn shelter uniform stood in stark contrast to Kane's expensive suit. Inside, Kane walked slowly through the kennels, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor as he listened intently to Walter sharing stories about Victor's dedication to the animals. His eyes kept following Max, who stayed close to Lily's stroller, occasionally nuzzling her tiny hand and earning delighted giggles from the baby. "Your father spent every Saturday here," Walter explained, showing Kane a wall of carefully preserved photos. "He believed every animal deserved a second chance, no matter their past." Kane's fingers traced a faded photograph of his father kneeling beside a younger Max, the same gentle expression on both their faces. His own expression softened as he watched the current Max demonstrate his gentle protectiveness of Lily, the dog's dedication unmistakable. "I had no idea," Kane admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "about any of this, about who he really was." As the visit drew to a close, Kane stood at his car door, keys dangling in his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine gratitude that surprised them both. "For not giving up." He paused, then added, "I need some time to think things through, to process all of this." Emma and Walter watched him drive away, sharing uncertain but hopeful glances. The shelter's future still hung in the balance, but something fundamental had changed in Harrison Kane's eyes, a glimpse of the man his father had always hoped he would become. The morning air was crisp as Emma pulled into the shelter's gravel parking lot, the stones crunching beneath her tires. Inside, she found Walter and a handful of volunteers huddled around a worn table covered in coffee cups and scattered papers, the aroma of coffee mingling with hope. Their voices carried a hint of renewed energy after Kane's unexpected visit yesterday, filling the usually quiet room with purpose. "Emma!" Walter's weathered face brightened, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening with his smile. "We were just discussing ways to save the shelter. Kane's visit has everyone talking." Rebecca, who had joined the volunteers, waved from her seat, her rescue shelter bracelet jingling. "Any word from him since yesterday?" Emma shook her head, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "Not yet. But we can't just wait around hoping." She settled into an empty chair, the old wood creaking beneath her, pulling out her notebook. "I've been thinking, what if we organized a community fundraiser? Something to show everyone what this place means to people like me and Rebecca." Walter's expression turned worried, his fingers drumming nervously on his coffee cup. "A fundraiser? Emma, we barely have enough volunteers to keep the shelter running day to day." "That's exactly why we need this," Emma insisted, her voice gaining strength with each word. "We could invite families who've adopted pets, share their stories, show Kane and everyone else why this place matters." The volunteers exchanged glances, some nodding slowly, others straightening in their chairs with growing enthusiasm. Rebecca stood up, her eyes bright with determination. "I'll help. My story isn't the only one worth telling." Before Walter could protest further, Emma's phone buzzed. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the message, her heart skipping a beat. "It's from Kane's office," she announced. "He's delayed the demolition for a week." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by murmurs of surprise. Walter sank into his chair, the wood groaning beneath him. "A week? That's not much time." "But it's something," Emma said firmly, squaring her shoulders. "It's a chance." The next few hours flew by in a whirlwind of activity as they planned. Rebecca called other adopters while volunteers designed flyers, the printer humming steadily in the background. Emma's kitchen calendar became command central, covered in tasks and deadlines, each day marked with colorful sticky notes and urgent reminders. That evening, Emma trudged up her front steps, her arms full of shelter paperwork, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. After paying the babysitter, she checked on Lily, who slept peacefully in her crib. The sight of Max curled protectively by the crib, his gentle brown eyes watching over her granddaughter, made her heart swell with gratitude and determination. "We're going to save your first home," she whispered to Max, who thumped his tail softly against the carpet, his eyes reflecting understanding. "I promise." The shelter grounds hummed with activity under the warm morning sun. Volunteers scurried back and forth, armed with brooms, decorations, and stacks of freshly printed pamphlets. Emma watched as Rebecca hung strings of twinkling lights across the outdoor kennels, transforming the simple space into something magical. The excited barking of the shelter dogs added a cheerful soundtrack to the bustling preparations. "These photos are perfect," Walter called from inside, spreading decades-old pictures across a display board. "Look at this one of Victor with the first dog he ever rescued here. That little fellow started it all." Emma paused her own task of arranging chairs to examine the faded photograph. It showed a younger Victor Kane kneeling beside a scruffy terrier, his smile gentle and proud. The love in his eyes was unmistakable. "We'll put this front and center," she decided, carefully positioning it where everyone would see it. Throughout the morning, Emma made calls between helping with preparations, her voice growing hoarse but determined. "It's not just about saving a building," she explained to each person she invited, passion evident in her tone. "It's about Max, who saved my granddaughter's life, and all the other animals who've changed people's lives too. Every dog and cat here has a story waiting to be told." To her surprise, many who had previously stayed silent now promised to attend. The story of Max protecting Lily touched something in them, making the shelter's importance real and personal. Some even offered to bring refreshments and extra chairs. By afternoon, former adopters began arriving with their pets, eager to help set up their stories for display. A woman with a three-legged German Shepherd shared how her dog helped her through cancer treatment, their bond visible in every gentle pat she gave him. An elderly man spoke softly about how his cat gave him a reason to live after losing his wife, his eyes brightening as he described their morning rituals. "Victor would have loved this," Walter said, his eyes misty as he watched the activity. His weathered hand smoothed another photograph with careful reverence. "You know, he used to spend Christmas mornings here, bringing treats to every animal. Said they deserved to feel special, too. He'd dress up as Santa Claus for them." Emma quickly jotted down his words, knowing they would add the perfect touch to her opening speech. A sleek car pulled up outside, and a woman in a business suit stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Mr. Kane sent me to observe the preparations," she announced, her tone professional, but not unkind. Emma's heart fluttered with nervous hope as she watched the representative make notes on her tablet, praying each tap of her finger was recording something positive. That evening, Emma sat in her living room, speech notes spread across her lap. Mac's warm head rested on her knee, his brown eyes watching her with steady devotion. The lamp cast a soft glow over them both as she ran her fingers through his soft fur, drawing comfort from his presence. "Tomorrow's a big day, buddy," she whispered, reviewing her words one more time. Her hand trembled slightly as she turned the page, but Mac's gentle weight helped steady her nerves. He nuzzled closer, as if sensing her anxiety. She knew that whatever happened, she had already witnessed something beautiful in how the community had come together, turning a simple shelter into a beacon of hope. The morning sun painted the shelter grounds in a warm golden light as cars began filling the makeshift parking area, their tires crunching on the gravel. Emma stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival with a smile that masked her nervous energy, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from fidgeting. Max sat faithfully by her side, his tail wagging as he welcomed visitors, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. "Thank you for coming," Emma said repeatedly, her heart warming at the growing crowd that exceeded her expectations. Volunteers in bright blue t-shirts led small groups through the displays, where photos and stories covered every available space, from easels to bulletin boards. Rebecca guided an elderly couple past the timeline of the shelter's history, pointing out significant moments and achievements with enthusiastic gestures. "This place saved my Sophie," a young mother told others as she knelt beside her rescue dog, scratching behind the shepherd mix's ears. "We both needed healing, and we found it here. I was at my lowest point when I met her." At precisely 10 o'clock, Walter stepped onto the small outdoor stage they'd assembled, his weathered hands gripping the microphone stand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Emma Thornton," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her notes, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. The faces before her blurred together in a sea of expectant looks. But she focused on Mac's steady presence at the foot of the stage and found her voice, drawing strength from his unwavering gaze. "6 months ago, I adopted Max from this shelter," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I thought I was saving him, but he ended up saving my granddaughter's life." She shared the story of Mac's vigilance, his incredible instinct that detected Lily's breathing problems, describing how he would paw at her crib and whine until someone came running. Tears glistened in many eyes as she described those terrifying nights and the diagnosis that followed, her own voice catching with emotion. "This shelter isn't just about saving animals," Emma continued, gesturing to the building behind her. "It's about second chances, healing, and the incredible bonds that form between humans and animals when given the opportunity. Every day, miracles happen here." Other speakers followed. The woman whose rescue dog helped her through cancer, staying by her side through chemotherapy sessions. The widower whose cat gave him purpose after 50 years of marriage. the troubled teen who found direction volunteering with the animals and was now studying to become a veterinarian. Each story added another layer of emotion to the atmosphere, weaving a tapestry of hope and redemption. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Harrison Kane appeared, standing quietly at the back, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual gathering. His presence sent a flutter of hope through Emma's chest, though his expression remained carefully neutral as he listened to the testimonials, occasionally shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The morning flowed into early afternoon, filled with tours, stories, and demonstrations of the shelter's work. Children laughed as they played with puppies in the exercise yard, their joy infectious, while adults clustered around the photo displays, discussing the shelter's impact on their community in hushed, earnest tones. As the event drew to a close, Kane made his way through the dispersing crowd toward Emma, his steps measured and deliberate. His usual businesslike demeanor seemed softer somehow, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes, which kept darting between Emma and the shelter building. "Thank you for inviting me," he said quietly, clearing his throat. "I need some time to process what I've seen here today, to think about everything." He glanced at Max, who sat attentively beside Emma, tail sweeping gently across the ground. "You've given me a lot to consider." Emma nodded, hope and anxiety mingling in her chest as she watched him turn and walk away through the autumn sunshine, his shadow stretching long across the grass. Harrison Kane sat in his dimly lit office, the city lights twinkling beyond his window like distant stars. On his polished desk lay 2 stacks of papers, the demolition documents on one side and his father's letter on the other. The evening shadows stretched across the room as he reached for Victor's letter with hesitant fingers. "Dear Harrison," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. The familiar handwriting made his throat tighten. His father's words spoke of regret, of countless nights wishing he'd been a better father, of hopes that the shelter could represent something more than just his absence. Kane's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading. "I know I wasn't there when you needed me," the letter said. "The shelter became my way of making amends, of giving others the second chance I wished I had with you." The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on his mind. He remembered Emma's passionate speech, the countless stories of lives transformed, and Max's protective presence beside little Lily. The dog's devotion reminded him of something his father once said about loyalty and unconditional love. Running his fingers through his hair, Kane leaned back in his leather chair. The demolition papers seemed to mock him from their neat pile. His ambitious plans for luxury apartments suddenly felt hollow against the backdrop of his father's final words and Emma's unwavering determination. "Maybe you were trying, Dad," he murmured, touching the corner of the letter. "In your own way." The memory of today's event played in his mind. The genuine joy in people's faces, the palpable sense of community, the stories of healing and hope. It was everything his father had tried to explain to him, everything he'd refused to see. With careful movements, Kane opened his desk drawer and placed Victor's letter inside. He turned toward the window, watching the city lights flicker against the darkening sky. For the first time since purchasing the property, he allowed himself to imagine the shelter remaining standing, continuing his father's legacy rather than erasing it. The next morning, Emma's hand shook as she answered her ringing phone. "Ms. Thornton? This is Mr. Kane's office. He'd like to meet you at the shelter in an hour." Emma's heart raced as she called her neighbor to watch Lily. The autumn breeze rustled fallen leaves across the shelter's parking lot as she waited, Walter standing quietly beside her. Max sat at her feet, his tail sweeping the ground in slow, steady strokes. Harrison Kane's sleek car pulled up precisely on time. He stepped out, looking less imposing in casual clothes. His usual stern expression softened somehow. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual sharp edge. They walked the grounds together, passing kennels where dogs wagged their tails hopefully. Kane paused at each one, asking questions about their stories. Walter shared memories of Victor's visits, how he'd spend hours with the animals, especially the older ones nobody wanted. He'd sit right there. Walter pointed to a wooden bench weathered by years of sun and rain, reading to the dogs. Said everyone deserves someone to talk to them kindly. Kane's shoulders tensed, then relaxed. "I remember that bench," he said quietly. "I used to wait there for him as a kid, watching him with the animals." They reached the shelter's small garden, where a plaque bore Victor Kane's name. Harrison traced the letters with his finger. "I spent years angry at him for choosing this place over our family," he admitted. "But being here now, seeing what Emma and Max have shown us about second chances." He trailed off, looking at the shelter's worn but welcoming facade. "This place isn't just about saving animals," Emma said gently. "It's about healing hearts, both human and animal. Max taught me that." Kane nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I've made a decision," he announced, turning to face them. "I'm withdrawing the demolition plans. More than that, I'm donating the land to the shelter. Permanently." Walter gasped softly, and Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Really?" she whispered. "Yes," Kane said firmly. "It's time to honor my father's legacy, not destroy it. This shelter will stay right where it belongs." Balloons and streamers decorated the shelter's entrance as people gathered in the crisp morning air. Emma couldn't stop smiling as she watched volunteers setting up folding chairs and tables laden with homemade treats. Max trotted beside her, his tail wagging as he greeted familiar faces. "I still can't believe it," Walter said, his eyes misty as he surveyed the growing crowd. Rebecca was there with her dog, along with dozens of other adopters who'd found their furry family members at the shelter. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Harrison Kane's car pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out, looking almost shy, so different from the intimidating figure who'd first dismissed Emma's pleas. He made his way to the small podium they'd set up, clearing his throat. "When I first planned to demolish this shelter," Kane began, his voice soft but steady, "I thought I was just making a business decision. But thanks to Emma Thornton's persistence and a very special dog named Max, I learned that some things are worth more than money." He paused, his hand gripping the podium. "My father understood that. This shelter was his way of making the world a little better, and I'm proud to continue that legacy." Emma stepped up next, holding Lily in her arms while Max sat attentively at her feet. "This shelter gave me Max, who saved my granddaughter's life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter Sarah always believed in fighting for what matters. In her memory, we're going to expand our programs to help more families find their perfect companions." The crowd burst into applause. Kane stepped forward to shake Emma's hand, and for the first time, she saw him smile, really smile. Little Lily reached out and patted his arm, making everyone laugh. As people mingled and shared stories, Emma watched Lily take wobbly steps across the grass, Max never more than a foot away. The loyal dog matched his pace to the toddler's, ready to steady her if she stumbled. Walter appeared beside Emma, offering her a cup of coffee. "Look at them all," he said, gesturing to the happy crowd. "Every person here has a story of hope because of this place." Emma nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle in her heart. She watched Kane talking with some of the volunteers, looking more at peace than she'd ever seen him. The shelter that had given her Max, saved Lily, and helped heal so many hearts would continue to be a sanctuary of second chances. Emma adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the new program outline spread across her desk. "The Second Chance Project," she read aloud, smiling at the name they'd chosen. Max lifted his head from where he dozed near her feet, his tail thumping against the floor. "It's perfect," Walter said, settling into the chair across from her. "Pairing rescue animals with families who need emotional support, just like Max and Lily." The shelter buzzed with fresh energy these days. Volunteers bustled through the halls, leading orientation sessions for new families. The kennels had been renovated, and cheerful paintings now brightened the walls. "Sarah would have loved this," Emma whispered, touching the small photo of her daughter she kept on her desk. The ache was still there, but it had softened into something that gave her strength rather than pain. Through the window, she watched as a young boy with autism connected with a gentle shepherd mix. His mother wiped away tears as the dog rested his head on the boy's lap. These moments happened more and more frequently now. "We've already matched 15 families," Walter said, shuffling through some papers. "And that's just in the first month." Emma nodded, her heart full. The shelter had become more than just a place for abandoned animals. It was a sanctuary where healing happened every day. People came not just to adopt, but to volunteer, to share their stories, to find hope. Kane had become a regular visitor, too, often bringing his young niece to play with the puppies. The transformation in him was remarkable. He'd even started a foundation in his father's name to support similar shelters across the state. "Remember when we thought we'd lose this place?" Walter chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. Emma reached down to scratch Max's ears. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you, buddy," she murmured. "You didn't just save Lily, you saved all of us." Later that evening, Emma sat on the wooden bench outside the shelter, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Max lay at her feet, his presence as steady and comforting as always. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. In this moment of quiet reflection, Emma felt Sarah's presence more strongly than ever. Not in the crushing wave of grief that had once threatened to drown her, but in the peaceful certainty that her daughter would be proud of what they'd accomplished here. A family emerged from the shelter's entrance, their newly adopted cat secure in a carrier. The little girl waved excitedly to Emma as they passed, and Emma waved back, her heart light with joy and gratitude. Max shifted closer, resting his head on her lap as the last rays of sunlight warmed their faces. Emma closed her eyes, finally at peace with where life had led her. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room floor, her heart racing as Lily pulled herself up against the coffee table. Max lay nearby, his brown eyes fixed on the toddler with watchful devotion. "Come on, sweetie," Emma coaxed, holding out her arms. "You can do it." Lily's tiny fingers released their grip on the table. She wobbled for a moment, her face scrunched in concentration. Then, with determination that reminded Emma so much of Sarah, she took one tentative step forward, then another. "That's it," Emma clapped, tears welling in her eyes. Max's tail thumped against the carpet as he inched closer, staying right beside Lily as she managed 3 more wobbly steps before plopping down on her bottom with a giggle. Emma scooped Lily into her arms, pressing kisses to her rosy cheeks. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. In that moment, memories of Sarah flooded back. Her first steps, her determined spirit, her passion for helping others. "Your mommy would be so proud of you," Emma whispered, running her fingers through Lily's soft curls. She thought about how far they'd come since those dark days after Sarah's accident. The crushing grief had slowly given way to purpose. thanks to Mac's unwavering presence and the community that had rallied around the shelter. Max nudged Emma's arm with his nose, and she scratched behind his ears. "And you, sweet boy, you've given us so much more than just a home for second chances." The shelter had become everything Sarah would have loved, a place where hope bloomed and lives were transformed. Emma thought about the families who now found healing through their rescue animals, just as she had with Max. Later that evening, Emma settled onto the front porch swing with Lily in her lap. Max lay at their feet, his golden fur painted orange by the setting sun. The shelter stood in the distance, its windows gleaming in the fading light. "We're going to be okay," Emma whispered, as Lily's delighted giggles filled the air and Max rested his head on her lap. If you enjoyed the story of Emma, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.